So, Mike, I don't want to destroy your thread of whatever you're thinking right now, but I did want to ask you, do you think that this idea of the hyperobject might relate to how an individual cell relates to the whole of the body? Because the body itself would be outside the cognitive light cone of the cell.
Yeah. I mean,
for example, in the context of, say, dancing, like two dancers who are learning how to dance together, when something has happened where they are actually dancing together, they both perceive and report a significant decrease in effort with an increase in effectiveness.
Yeah.
So a significant decrease in the amount of effort necessary to dance. And there's a transition, right? There's an actual process of practice. And then something like entrainment or harmonization, which is very subtle, right? You can't actually ever enumerate the total set of things that are associated with that. It's an extremely complex phenomenon, but it's something that, one, you can get better at, and two, everybody goes through it when they do it. And when you get to that critical point, something occurs where there's actually now an identity, and that identity is larger than the two individuals and is doing something that radically reduces their perception of effort, and to outside observers increases the quality of what they're doing together.
Yeah.
Same happens with, say, again, like a jazz band, a sports team, any collaborative group. Actually, every collaborative group notices that there is some kind of protocol of relationality that produces this experience of coming together into something like an identity that has a double whammy of decreasing the amount of effort that each individual experiences and increases the effectiveness of the group.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
The reason that we were going slower than those was it Taliban or Hamas? Because they had the distributed cognition going, just like in the market, just like with the price mechanism in the market, that just it propagates on its own because of all the human action involved, and it propagates so much faster than what you can analyze it, than what you can break it down. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
let me sort of restate that last part. So what was ultimately happening was that you had a competition between a form of collective intelligence that was more fully leveraging the signal propagation dynamics of the market, and a form of collective intelligence, for a variety of reasons, that was ultimately gated by the signal propagation capabilities of a bureaucracy. And so what happened was there's things that you and you can evolve, or how do you say, you can design novel capacities in either substrate. You can think of, like, say, for example, I don't know, something like eBay or Uber are mechanisms that are able to play with the market meshwork element, and then construct something on top of that, structure that and use that in a certain way. So they're blending these two functions together. So, let's say our team, JSOC, was sitting with a particular bureaucratic fundamental and had to substantially increase the more meshwork. The technique is called network of networks. So they had to innovate a much more networked methodology because the adversary was already using a much more networked methodology. And it turns out that a properly structured network has certain capabilities in terms of velocity of action and actual bandwidth of propagation of perception that more vertically oriented World War II style bureaucracies just can't do. It doesn't have the same level of concentrated energy delivery, right? They can't build nuclear weapons or deliver them, but that wasn't the nature of that conflict.
I think this is why poetry teaches people more than long lectures. Because the poetry opens you up to this space where the tumblers sort of fall into place on their own without having to think it through piece by piece. So,
and I say back to you a different way, because I'm interested in if this unlocks anything. So the way I've long thought of it is that it's because poetry is actually more fundamental. Every form of prose is actually a form of narrow poetry. But not every form of poetry is a form of prose. So it's basically, when you're communicating in poetry, what you're doing is you're communicating at a more fundamental substrate. And so you're learning the more fundamental substrate, and that carries a substantially different quality. Prose is a subset of poetry that has very specific capabilities. It's more sort of narrow and vertical. It's quite good for organizing cookbooks and planning trips to Disneyland, but that's what it's good for. And it's not anywhere near as good as, say, conveying meaning.
So Mike, I know you have to go.
Different kinds of writing, scientific papers, language, poetry in particular, as the middle of that bow tie. You know, this incredibly compressed thing that you will then have to creatively uncompress and apply in your own mind to whatever meaning it has to you, and it will be on you to sort of pull the details out of it that are not there in a linear way, the way that you just said, you know, with a cookbook, where the fidelity there really is to the specifics of the information. It, you know, if I say, you know, this many cups of whatever, it really has to be that, versus in a deeper compression, you get some sort of an aphorism even, or a deep truth encoded in a really tight kind of a message that you will then have to unpack, and you may unpack in all kinds of, you know, interesting ways. And the other thing about poetry and art in general is that, you know,